Welcome to today's online class. Today I'll be talking about a Canadian poet, Derek Walcott. And in the process, I'll be talking about the quintessential achievement of some of the important, recently, emerging Commonwealth poets. Okay, I'll be talking about that poetry through. Particularly today, one of the major figures, whose name is Derek Walcott. And I'm sure that today's lecture is going to help to put in a very slightly better perspective the overall Canadian poetic achievement in recent years. And I'll be looking at it from Commonwealth point of view, contemporary Commonwealth literature point of view. So let me begin with the whole introduction about Derek Walcott, because Derek Walcott happens to be one of the influencing figures of Canadian poetry. Derek Walcott was born in 1930, and he was the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1992, and he is a Canadian, in fact, he is a Caribbean poet, Caribbean poet from the island of St. Lucia. And one of the unique things about him is that, he does a lot of, obviously he is into teaching, so he does a lot of teaching, and he's quite mobile, he's not, a static person, sitting at one place, he's very mobile, and there have been two poets who have had very profound influences on him and on his writing, particularly the American poet Robert Lowell, and the another poet happens to be the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. These are the two major influences on his writing, Derek Walcott's writing. Let me talk about his some major works, and his major works include Dream on Monkey Mountain, which was published in 1967. Oh Babylon, that's another work which was published in 1976. Viva Detroit, was published in 1992. In the Green Knight poems, ranging from 1948 to 60. So that was published in 1962. That's a poem. And then you have The Castaway. This is another influential work which was published in 1965. There's The Gulf, then Another Life, Omeros, and The Fortunate Traveler. These are his major works, for which he is known. And now, when we talk about his other qualities, he was the one, Derek Walcott, who in fact, Walcott is the one who founded the Trinidad Theatre Workshop in 1959, where many of his own plays were first performed, and his theatre mingles prose and verse both, Creole vocabulary, calypso rhythms, etc., and it is often preoccupied with national identity, with the choice of home or exile, even self-realization or spiritual betrayal of country, So in his plays, we find that when we look at the language of his plays, his theatre mingles both prose as well as verse, Creole vocabulary, we have calypso rhythms are present, So this is about his plays now. Now let me talk about his major concerns, in his poetry, because we're talking about contemporary, Commonwealth poetry, particularly with reference to Canadian, poetry, and so when you look at Walcott's poetry, it is deeply concerned with the conflict between the heritage of European and West Indian culture. So this is the kind of a dichotomy which we find between those two kinds of traditions. One is the heritage of European tradition, and the other one is of West Indian cultural tradition. And Walcott's poetry deals with the kind of conflict which is emerging between these two traditional, approaches, European approach and West Indian approaches, And as far as his important poetry is concerned, he has published a very famous poem which is entitled Omeros, okay, which was published in 1990, and Omeros happens to be Derek Walcott's most formidable poem, And in this poem, which was entitled Omeros, Walcott imaginatively uses the Homeric narratives, okay, as the basis of a modernist long poem. In this poem, which is entitled Omeros, Derek Walcott imaginatively uses the Homeric narratives as the basis of a modernist long poem. And there has been a widespread recognition, okay, about his writings, and his own widespread recognition came with his publication, which was entitled "In a Green Night," poems from 1948 to 60, which was published in 1962. And there have been a number of other poems also and writings. For example, The Castaway, which was published in 1965, The Gulf, published in 1970, Another Life, which I was talking about, And these are the books, you can say, which really gave him a widespread recognition. And what we find is that we find various elements of, irony being present there. So like ironic, even antithetical poetry of personal and artistic discovery are found in these writings, And moreover, detached and skeptical poetry, like religious and drift, okay, has followed. Another, book, another, writing which was entitled Sea Grapes, which was published in 1976. So he has published a wide range of, issues, okay, through his writings, okay. And one, if you find one major theme of Walcott's writing, it is the dichotomy between black and white, even subject and ruler, and the elements of both Caribbean as well as Western civilization being present in his culture and ancestry. So the dichotomy between these two binary things, black and white, subject and ruler, Caribbean and Western civilization, is being dealt with in his writings. And one well-known poem, which is entitled A Far Cry from Africa, which is written in a Green Night, poems 1948 to 60, deals directly with Walcott's sense of cultural confusion, So he deals with issues of conflict, dichotomy, cultural confusion, okay. So these are the issues which he's dealing with. And I'm reminded of his poem, okay, which was published in a Green Night, poems 1948 to 60, where he's writing a beautiful poem, which goes like this. He writes, where shall I turn, divided to the vain, I who have cursed the drunken officer of British rule, how choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love? Betray them both or give back what they give? So here what you feel is that you see how the dichotomy between two cultures is being highlighted here. Drunken officer British rule, he's talking about that, okay, and he's talking about dichotomy between African and English tongue. He's saying between this African and English tongue I love, okay, betray them, should I betray them or give back what they give? Give back to Western people what they have given us, So this conflict, you find the element of conflict, the element of cultural differences, confusion, okay, getting revealed, okay, manifested in his writings. In another poem, which is entitled "The Schooner Flight," from his collection "The Star Apple Kingdom," the poet is using a Trinidadian sailor named Shabine, okay, to apprise his own place as a person of mixed blood. in the world divided into whites and blacks. So again, here he is just presenting this whole dichotomy, the division between black and white. He's using the Trinidadian sailor, as his one of the characters, and he writes, about this mariner. He says, according to the mariner, the first chained my hands and apologized. History. The next said I wasn't black enough for their pride. Not white for whites, not black enough for blacks. Now Shabine sums up the complexity of his situation near the beginning of the poem, saying, he says, I'm just reading those lines. I had a sound colonial education. I have Dutch, nigger, and English in me, and either am nobody or am a nation. So again, here, what Walcott is doing here is that, through his character, Shabine, Trinidadian, character, Shabine, he is bringing that conflict, which is emerging within him, he's talking about his own identity. He says, I'm a colonial educated person, I'm having like Dutch, nigger, and English, all these languages in me. So either I'm nobody or I'm a nation. Maybe I belong to a nation, maybe a nation. So the whole element of this conflict is emerging, through his, poems, which we can, easily notice. Now the poems in The Bounty, which was published in 1997, The Bounty, the name of the book, which addressed many of Walcott's chief concerns, including the problems of language, the problem of colonialism, the problem of history, but a more pronounced fixation on aging or even death and loss emerges as well. And critics have, praised Walcott for his mastery of language. Not only for his mastery of language, but also for his, mastery of poetic technique. Images keep recurring, crisscrossing, gaining new associations in verses that have the noble radiance of stained glass, grave but full of light. So we find various kinds of images, recurring, crisscrossing, gaining new associations, in the form of verses also. In his other poems, such as The Spoiler's Return, what he's doing is that he's exploring more direct and orthodox Creole forms, in this poem. But also, in a technique used by many other writers, he is giving standard form of English, a distinctive note by the subtle intrusion of a Caribbean lexicon, Caribbean syntax, even Caribbean rhythm, So here he is making use of Creole language, and particularly, when talking about Creole language, he's making use of, a Caribbean lexicon, Caribbean syntax, Caribbean rhythm, Now, in a deliberate mingling of, if you, further pursue his writings, you'll find that, a deliberate mingling of Greek and Yoruba pantheons. For example, Walcott, as in Fold cosmology, turns an island hurricane into a vision of the gods having a wild party. He's describing, he's visualizing, he's presenting the visualization of that thing, where we find a vision of gods, having a wild party. They are, engaged with, party, they're celebrating. He writes, the abrupt Shango drums made Neptune rock in the caves. Fete start, fete start. And Erzuli rattling, Herrera, Ogun the blacksmith feeling no pain, Dambala whining like a Zanoli lizard, as the feet thudded on the ceiling, as the sea god, drunk, nursed from wall to wall, saying, Mama, this music so loud, I'm going insane. What brings the gods close is this thunderous weather, where Ogun can fire one with his partner Zeus. So we see here, how he is, portraying various kinds of goddess. He's portraying that image where they're having party. We see people can, I'm going insane, because of this music. They like the music. They enjoy the music, So he's creating another worldliness, visualization of another worldliness, where we see, the vision of gods, having, wild party. That's what he's doing, to his poems. Now, if you look at his short poem, which is entitled Tomorrow and Tomorrow, uh, you find that it's very, very interesting, and two of its verse paragraphs, particularly, let me read two paragraphs, okay, from this short poem, which is entitled Tomorrow and Tomorrow. He writes, I remember the cities I have never seen exactly. Silver Vening, Leningrad, with its toffee twisted minerals. Paris, soon the Impressionists will be making sunshine out of shade. Oh, and the uncoiling cobra alleys of Hyderabad. You find this, element of, cosmopolitanism, getting, revealed. And then he further writes, a world's outside the door, but how upsetting to stand by your bags on a cold step at dawn. Roses the brick walk, and before you start regretting, your tax is coming with one beep of its horn, settling to the curves like heels. So you get in, So look at, how he is engaging with, this cosmopolitanism, its identity, He's talking about various, kinds of cultures, coming together, And this really shows the great, cosmopolitanism of, Derek Walcott as compared to many Canadian poets. We don't find these kind of elements, are being presented by other Canadian poets, okay, which Walcott is doing, Ondatsi also has a lot of cosmopolitanism too, but that goes more into novels like The English Patient. But here Walcott, he is engaging with the element of cosmopolitanism in his poetry. So he happens to be one of the important cosmopolitan poet of Canada. Now, as I told you earlier, that he had a greater influence of Lowell, okay, in his writings. And Lowell was a major influence on Derek Walcott. And Lowell's sense of history was congenial to Walcott's own, because it had classical, European, colonial, and post-colonial, all fused in it. So Walcott's is hybrid sensibility. We have known about its hybridity, and it's a very healthy kind of hybridity too. So Canadian poetry as a whole has less hybridity in it. Canadian poetry as a whole, when you look at the whole Canadian poetry, Walcott has a wonderful collection also, which is called, Midsummer. And this poem happens to be a very remarkable poem, okay, for some of the reasons, like for its dense texture. It is also remarkable for its complex contemporaneous imagery and for the depths of its versification. So all these elements are present in his collection called Midsummer. Here, if you look at, one of the characteristic influences, okay, you will find that here Walcott is in the Lowell vein. He was, as I told you earlier also, he was highly influenced by Lowell, especially Lowell of the sonnet, sequence notebook. He's making use of that in this collection, Midsummer. So we find a lot of influences of Lowell's, okay, in his writings in this collection, which is entitled the Midsummer, And such complex clusters of images that form a nexus are rare in Canadian poetry. So we find very rarely this kind of mixtures being used, complex clusters of images, okay, which are used in Canadian poetry by Walcott. So we don't find many other poets making use of these complex clusters of images in his writings, So what we find is that we see here how Walcott is dealing with certain issues which are cosmopolitan in characteristic. He is also making use of issues, sort of conflict. He's talking about conflict, okay, and he's talking also about dichotomy between two kinds of cultures, okay, two kinds of societies, particularly talking also about black and white, okay, the whole dichotomy happening between black and white, between two cultures, okay, Western culture and Canadian culture, and the fact that he is including a lot of, you can say, issues of conflict, makes him to be a very exclusive writer. Okay, and well, we know that he is dealing with issues which were, very prominent during that time, and he is one of those rarest, writers, who is bringing in, a unique kind of language, and he's making use of Creole poetry in his writings. Okay, he's making use of, Caribbean language, Caribbean poetry, Caribbean lexicon. Okay, and and we find that particularly the influence of novels, okay, in his writing, novels in his writing, he's making use of, as I told you, a lot of images, okay, and he is also making use of certain, visualizations, okay, as I told you, in his earlier poems, also making use of visualizations where we see him portraying the image of, wild party, which we have seen, okay, how he's doing that, so to conclude with, what I will say is that, Derek Walcott has created a unique space in Commonwealth poetry. When we look at Commonwealth poetry with Canadian context, and with unique images and a unique kind of technique, applying to his poetry, and also with the kind of themes he is using in his poetry. He happens to be a cosmopolitan poet, and he's making use of cosmopolitanism also in his writings. So I hope that today's lecture has helped you to understand about Derek Walcott, okay, one of the major influences of Commonwealth, Canadian poetry. So that's it for today. Thank you so much.